Welcome everyone. It's with great pleasure that I invite Professor Sasheej Hegde to give his talk this afternoon. Sasheej teaches sociology at Hyderabad, University of Hyderabad. He has a wide set of interests, modernity being one of them. Also the philosophy of social science, especially doing sociology in India. And he's also interested in issues of legal jurisprudence, vis-a-vis questions of epistemology. His talk today is titled An Interface with the Anthropology of Secularism, a brief genealogy and beyond. Sasheej, come.
Okay, it's nice to be here. One of the elusive meetings, but then I thought, okay, I should go through it this time round. So although I'm on a very personal visit, to Bangalore. I thought I should, kind of meet the obligations of this meeting. So it's. Can you all hear? Or should I move this? Yeah. Okay. So I must perhaps also personally thank Chandan for seeing this through, and perhaps, I mean, there were 2-3 topics that I had in mind, but then kind of zeroed in on this one. And part of what I'm presenting is forthcoming in a special number of a journal, which will be coming out soon. But then I would just thought, given the formal nature of the occasion, work through something more systematic and so on. I mean, Chandan has already indicated the title, An Interface with the Anthropology of Secularism, a little scholarly genealogy and beyond. And beyond is perhaps one way by which one can find one's own feet in the kind of moves that I'm trying to make. Right? I'm also not entirely sure about what is the background of the students out here, and whether they are grounded in some of the questions about religion and politics, about debating contested normative political ideals and so on. But I think the framework I'm trying to outline could be extended, as I say in my abstract, to also debating not just issues and contested ideals like secularism, but also other kinds of socio-political ideals as well. But my focus for the talk is going to be the anthropology of secularism, and that's why I use the word a little scholarly genealogy. What is the little of it, and what is the scholarly genealogy that I'm talking about? Because the word genealogy can communicate a lot of things, but I think I try to kind of offset that genealogical emphasis with the scholarly part of it. So it is working off certain strands of discussion that are available. And and I think I stand by every word of the abstract that has been communicated to you, and my lecture will kind of adhere to every injunction in that abstract that has been communicated of you, because I mean, abstracts are all abstracts, and faculty can just take off, etc. But I think every formulation in the abstract will meet with some of the elaboration that my lecture will provide for you. So let me start with this. Given the work of this anthropologist historian Talal Asad, okay, and Talal Asad formulated in the context of his work an important distinction between what he called secular and secularism, right? Okay, and in instituting that distinction between secular and secularism, he was also instituting some interesting possibilities for the anthropology of secularism, right? What he meant by the secular, okay, is a domain of historically constituted and variably related behaviors, sensibilities, and ways of knowing, right? It's a fairly open-ended definition of the secular, and juxtaposed it against what he called secularism, okay, as a doctrine and political arrangement within the modern state, right? And I think, especially in the context of this distinction that Assad instituted between the secular and secularism in the terms specified, I think the study of both secularity as an object of analysis and the question of the interface between law and religion in the context of modern secularism has been, as I see it, divided into two fractious halves, right? Two fractious components, okay? One side emphasizing the moral psychology of religion or the reality of religion, as indeed of the secular, okay, and the politics of secularism, right? Of course, it is certainly true that not all who are ranged across the terms of this divide, okay, need accept or follow Talal Assad's expansive reading of the genealogy of the secular. If you read his book, The Formations of the Secular, he will institute the terms of this genealogy of the secular, right? And also, what is more, Assad himself, in instituting the distinction between the secular and secularism, okay, never saw the two as fully separable, right? And even argued what he termed the secular is conceptually prior, right, to secularism as a doctrine, okay, and as part of that analysis, he asked how the concepts of the secular, okay, as the concepts, assumptions, and sensibilities and practices work within the domain of the secular, work to support or undermine secularism as a modern political arrangement, right? So what you have, what I'm trying to argue is there is a certain, what I'm calling a scholarly genealogy implicating the modalities of this analysis, right? What I call, a division between the fact of the religious or the secular and or of the secular and the instrumental use of religion and or of secularism, as it were, right? Okay, and even as the anthropology of secularism has worked across the terms of this distinction, the distinction does obtain, right, etc. Okay, so what I'm arguing is that there is some kind of a diagnostic limit for various histories and ethnographies of secularism. Okay, and what I'm trying to do in this lecture is actually complicate that diagnostic limit within which these histories and anthropologies or ethnographies of secularism proceed, right? Now, in fact, within the terms that I have set for you in terms of this diagnostic limit, I also glimpse within the anthropology of secularism less a definitional division than an overarching antinomy, if you will, between an earlier distinction or a parallel distinction which was instituted by one of our own scholars, Ashish Nandi, between religion as faith and religion as ideology, right? Okay, and he had outlined this quite some time ago in trying to speak about the politics of secularism in India and articulate what he called an anti-secularist manifesto and so on, right? So I'm arguing that in the terms of that distinction, that limit that I've instituted for you, one can also see the shades of a definite of this antinomy between religion as faith and religion as ideology. Okay, in fact, what was Nandi doing? Okay, questioning a whole mode of investment on the secular idea or ideal, Ashish Nandy had asserted that it is both necessary and possible, okay, to draw a dividing line between religion as faith and religion as ideology, okay, and that while the pole of faith, okay, corresponds to traditions and ways of life, okay, which are, as he puts it, definitionally non-monolithic and operationally plural, okay, religion as faith, right, calls attention to an instrumental and also obtaining outside the grid of modernity, the pole of religion as ideology calls attention to an instrumental concept of religion, okay, as the principle which is useful for political mobilization and also for state formation, right. Strictly, and I have written about this, this analysis accepts no possible mediation between religion as faith and religion as ideology, because religion as ideology can only distort religion as faith, okay, while also holding in the same breath that the modern state, and I'm quoting Ashish Nandy, the modern state always prefers to deal only with religious ideologies rather than with faiths, right. So what I'm saying is that that diagnostic limit that I started with, okay, is part of a larger landscape of theorizing about phenomena relating to religion and politics, or even the politics of secularism, and so on. Okay. Now, surely one denouement of the kind of issues that I'm posing for you is precisely what Nandy is getting at, thus reinforcing the division that I gestured at the very beginning of this lecture. Okay? And accordingly, one's own insertion into and reiteration of that genealogy, right? I'm calling it a scholarly genealogy, right? Because as I said, the word genealogy can have a whole lot of emphasis, which perhaps my scholarly that grammatical form kind of constricts and allows for other kinds of negotiations and so on. Okay. Now, as we work across the work that is available in the Anthropology of Secularism, okay, and I must say there are very layered histories and ethnographies on offer, I begin to wonder whether that insertion and reiteration is inevitable or even necessary, whether that location within that genealogy is inevitable or even necessary. Indeed, how, and this is important, a cognate conceptual framework, which I will indicate as we go along, might lead us to rethink this very constrained and circumscribed scholarly genealogy and its entrenchment within the scholarship that is available for us. Okay. In fact, in other words, as I have tried to speak elsewhere, of the space specifically of Nandy, in a piece that I wrote in the EPW back in 2001 or 2, okay, and I think quite a lot of the work that has followed in the wake of that, not my work in terms of other works that are available, also reiterate this point. I think we must be pressing after more complex understandings of the mediations between religion, law, and the state. Okay. Why should the fact of the religious, say religion as faith, be the ground on which the instrumental use of religion as ideology, be instituted, right? Or put it in another way, is the analytically apt referent of religion as ideology, the instrumental use of religion, okay, only religion as faith, the fact of the religious or the secular, right? Even more pointedly, how might a problematic of what I am going to term normative secularity, and in the context of normative secularity, how do we think about secular moral legal commitments, right? Our moral secular legal commitments, etc., can touch on the question of a revitalized analytics of secularism, right? Okay, and the dynamics of religion, law, and state that I think any revitalized analytics of secularism must presuppose. I know the word analytics is very much in the air, but one is not definitely talking about the analytics that is much in the air, right? Okay. And that's why I think the challenge of trying to look at the kind of available work in the anthropology of secularism and applications of some of the terms of analysis instituted by Talal Asad, and perhaps even prior in the context of the distinctions posited by Ashish Nandi. So let's move on. Now, I must hasten to add that I'm not thinking of the innovative and captivating thoughts anchoring the Middle East anthropologist Hussein Ali Agrama, right, who speaks of what he calls the intractability of secular power, okay, and even as he speaks of the intractability of secular power, speaks of secularism, right, as what he calls a problem space, okay, which resists, and secularism as a problem space, according to Agrama, resists the pull of normative conceptions of the secular and the religious, okay, as if they each had transhistorical essences, right? And Agrama opens instead to the prospect, and I'm quoting him, the processes by which secular doctrine is implemented incessantly generate the very questions that doctrine aims to answer, right? Namely, where to draw the line between religion and politics, right? While I do take Agrama's suggestion that secularism's power may lie more in the questions that it provokes, okay, and obliges us to answer than in the normativity of the categories that secularism presupposes, I'm also interested to think hard with normative secularity, or in my canon, our secular moral legal commitments, right? Indeed, ask this question whether the very normativity that is the fount of secularism's power to insist on a line drawn between religion and politics, and even more emphatically, for our purposes here, binds or fortifies the singular nature of secular moral legal commitments. I will get to this axis presently, okay, but let me work through certain other conceptual knots. In fact, Agrama, in his book Questioning Secularism, okay, is drawing on Talal Asad's inaugural explorations of secularism, while also seeking actually to move beyond the terms of that genealogy. Okay? Indeed, for Agrama's order of questioning secularism, okay, or even more generally within the ambit of the anthropology of secularism, it is not enough to be accepting the conceptual priority of the secular, right? In fact, that was articulated by Asad himself, right? Okay. We must also be reversing the question hitherto bearing on a history and anthropology of secularism. That is to say, not quite only asking how the concepts, assumptions, sensibilities, and practices constitutive of the domain of the secular work to support or undermine secularism as a modern political arrangement, and that I spoke about as part of my inaugural gesture in terms of trying to look with Asad. Okay, in fact, Asad himself had argued, okay, rather that how does secularism work to support or undermine those concepts, sensibilities and assumptions and behavior that of the secular that it both draws upon and depends upon, right? Okay, in fact, for Asad and the anthropology of secularism, the fact that the secularism and secular are constantly drawing each other into existence, okay, is part of a paradoxical quality of secularism's power, right? Okay, and as a reiteration of this paradoxical quality, Agrama actually goes on to restate the questions at the center of his work. Namely, and this is the question, how then does secularism as a form of power work, right? What work does it do upon the behavior, attitudes, and ways of knowing that constitute our ways of life? Okay, and incidentally, these questions are contextually explored in Agrama's work in the context of law, politics, and religion in contemporary Egypt. Okay, so somewhere along the way, what Agrama is doing is to restate the problem that he inherits from Asad and then push it in some interesting directions. Strictly, what this restatement yields is a recognition, and I quote Agrama, the very principle of state sovereignty entails that the state be properly imbricated within the sociality over which it ostensibly presides. Okay? And accordingly, that state sovereignty, while being claimed, critiqued, contested, undermined, ever since its inception as a modern concept, has not diminished in its importance as an organizing concept of contemporary life, right? And this is true of the kind of, kind of fixation with the state that we have even in our post-colonial locations like India. Okay, the purpose and power of an anthropology and history of secularism is thus political and diagnostic, right? Political and diagnostic as a method or genealogy instantiating how secularism, secular power itself tends to make religion into an object of politics and enables the assertion of state sovereignty, okay, into more intimate domains of social life, right? Evidently then, for the purposes of this revitalized analytics of secularism, and for me here, I'm looking at the revitalization suggestions offered in Agrama's work, right? As represented here for us by Agrama, that this order of questioning translates into, I think we are not far from the division or the antinomy instituted by Nandi between religion as faith and religion as ideology, albeit, I think, a more sophisticated variant of that distinction, right, etc. Okay, and strictly, does not avoid, what I'm saying is, even as Agrama breaks new grounds, it does not avoid the general little scholarly genealogy that I alluded to at the beginning of my lecture. Okay, now that's why we need to take seriously some of the questions that I formulated earlier. Okay, and arguing. When I was arguing for more complex mediations, understanding of the mediations between religion, law, and the state. Okay, I think without repeating those questions that I have already indicated in the early part of the lecture, let me kind of condense those questions into a more precipitate formulation for the considerations that I'm going to develop as we go along. How do we think, and the question I'm now formulating in the wake of those earlier sets of questions is, how do we think about normative secularity, right? Or if you want, keep it more open-ended, our secular moral legal commitment specifically from within the questions that it provokes, okay? Okay, because normative secularity provokes questions, and from within that questions that it provokes, how do we think about normative secularity? And the very normativity of the categories that the idea of normative secularity presupposes, right? Okay. Indeed, as I've tried to formulate elsewhere, and in fact, when I was working on this paper, I began to realize how much my thinking has not changed in the last 15, 16 years when I first wrote that paper and so on. And it did alarm me that my thinking hasn't changed. But I thought, no, maybe I need to forcefully articulate what I actually indicated quite earlier, although I was free to actually change my positions on the question from the early 2000 piece and now 2018. Okay. In fact, as I've formulated elsewhere, a theory of secularism in the sense of a theory about possessing the concept secular is quite distinct, and this is important, is quite distinct from a theory about how the concept secular represents, right? And what is more, that much of the debate on secularism in India, as indeed elsewhere, as my reflections here have already seemed to indicate, most of the issues, most of the work on this, in the context of this debate, has been concerned to press on the latter question, namely how the concept secular represents, right? Not in the sense of a theory about possessing the concept secular, right? I'm not going to give you a full answer, okay, but nevertheless, I think for the revitalized analytics of secularism that I'm trying to kind of place before you, some of these considerations need to be formulated. In fact, that's why in getting an initial measure of what I'm terming normative secularity, or specifically the secular moral legal commitments internal to normative secularity, okay, I turn to the resolute philosopher Charles Taylor, whose rich corpus of writings offer a window into our theme of normative secularity, right? Of course, I will complicate the term, this terrain on its own normative ground, okay, but let me pose for you the initial construal in all its detail, okay. In fact, Taylor, following his opus, A Secular Age, and developing on the themes that he indicates in that opus, A Secular Age, Charles Taylor tells us that, and I'm quoting him, it is generally agreed that modern democracies have to be secular, right? And that, and I'm again quoting, while a certain ethnocentricity attaches to that term, to this term, secular, right? Even in the Western context, it is far from limpid, okay? He speaks quickly of at least two models abroad today of what constitutes a secular regime, right? Both invoking a kind of separation between church and state, okay, but maintains that given the pluralism of society, secularism also requires some kind of neutrality, or borrowing on Rajiv Bhargav's work, speaks of a principled distance, right? More stringently yet, and this is where I'm interested in exploring Taylor further, Taylor astutely posits that secularism involves, in fact, a complex requirement, right? In that it seeks more than one good, right? He singles out three goods, okay, classifying them in the three categories of the French revolutionary trinity: liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? And then he offers a clarification of these terms, etc., but students could, students and faculty alike could read his work, not in the Secular Age, but in the work that has followed after that book, A Secular Age. Taylor also admits that these goals, okay, liberty, equality, fraternity, as part of the goods that secularism strives for, okay, can conflict, okay, and sometimes we have to balance the goods which are involved here, right? But he points out that in this effort at mediation and balancing between these goods, there are certain principles that need to be in perspective, right? That there is no set of timeless principles, okay, which can be determined by pure reason alone, okay? All of us would accept that. That situations differ very much, okay, and therefore require different concrete realizations of certain principles, okay, and that dictating the principles from which some supposedly higher authority above the fray violates, etc., might also have to be taken into account. Of course, in committing himself to secular moral commitments of the order that he is here conceiving, Taylor is working off, and this is very true, of the secular West, right? And its present or ongoing challenges, right? Surely there is something ethnocentric there, right? So need this ethnocentricity pose a debilitating constraint upon the space of our construal, right? I don't think so. And besides, as I noted earlier, okay, and that's why I repeated those lines, our attempt is less about how the concept secular represents than a theory, okay, or if not a theory, some normative intimations really about possessing the concept secular, right? Okay. Taylor himself, in the article that I have been quoting from, recognizes that the word secular can crop up everywhere. Okay. It can crop up even in the stock exchange, incidentally, right? Okay. And that there are subtle differences in each iteration. Okay. And therefore, to have a cross-cultural discussion on these matters can be quite a befuddling exercise, right? He also admits that the constellation of terms, including secular and religious, with all its baggage of ambiguity and deep assumptions in the history of the West, begins to travel, right? And can, through creative and productive redefinitions, leave the connotations of the word secular, as they've evolved through Western history, quietly to the side, right? Etc. Okay. In fact, that's what, I mean, if one were to look at these reminders on Taylor's behalf, then Taylor is reminding us that one needs to be wary of the wrong model in dealing with normative secularity, or with the nature of our secular moral legal commitments, right? That's why he thinks, and this is important, he very sharply observes, we think, and I'm quoting, we think that secularism has to do with the relation of the state and religion, okay? Whereas, in fact, okay, it has to do with the correct response of the democratic state to diversity, right? And what is more, in doing so, in restating the problem of secularism in this way, there is no reason to single out religion as against non-religious secular or atheistic viewpoints. In fact, he goes on to insist, all too ethnocentrically perhaps, indeed the point of state neutrality is precisely to avoid favoring or disfavoring not just religious positions, but any basic position, religious or non-religious. Okay? In fact, as he puts it, we can't favor Christianity over Islam, nor can we favor religion over non-belief in religion or vice versa. Right? Now, clearly for Taylor, there is more to secularism than religion as the problem. Right? Indeed, that the idea that secularism makes a special case for religion arises from the history of its coming to be in the West. But argues that this certainly requires redefinition even within the West. Right? He also insists that we must resist the tendency to define secularism, okay, in terms of some institutional arrangement, right? As delivered in formulae such as separation of church and state, okay, or the necessity or separating the necessity of religion from public space, and so on. What Taylor renders, and these are the fetishized institutional arrangements within which our conceptions of normative secularity often proceed. Okay? Rather, he argues that you should start from those three basic goods, okay, and derive the concrete arrangements from those three basic goods of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Right? Of course, this is easier said than done, okay, and there can be difficulties here, which our public avowal of normative secularity and the attendant order of its secular moral legal commitments, even in the way Taylor recharacterizes it, must acknowledge and duly consider. I want to attend to two orders of complication, okay, bearing on our theme that I have reconstructed so far. One issuing from the very space of a history and anthropology of secularism that I have tried to move beyond, okay, and the second, which is consistent with the normative ground of my appraisal, as it were. So these are the two orders of complication, right? With reference to the first order of complication, taking resources of the anthropology and history of secularism, of the scholarship which is there, I turn to another recent essay by Hussein Ali Agrama again, right? Who, from within his history and ethnography of the state, law, politics, and religion in contemporary Egypt, questions Taylor's redefinition of normative secularity in the ways that I have specified, right? Maintaining that Taylor's redefinition doesn't ultimately work, right? Either as an analysis of or as an ideal for secularism, okay? In fact, he certainly finds Taylor's suggestion that we must avoid fetishization of our favored institutional arrangements, okay, which often singles out religion as the problem, okay, and that secularism is better thought of as a response of the democratic state to diversity, right? Okay, but maintains that Taylor's argument embeds a set of historical sensibilities and attitudes that it does not fully take into account. Okay, and if you take those sensibilities, historical sensibilities and attitudes into account, then you could complicate Taylor's normative proposals, right? And you could even undermine Taylor's normative proposals. In fact, commenting on what Agrama calls the confounding way that religious freedom is defined and implemented by a variety of contemporary states, Agrama speaks of a distinctive structure of what he calls legalized suspicion, right? Okay, underwriting contemporary secularity, okay, and which, while issuing from, as he calls it, a distinctively liberal vigilance against power and its abuse, okay, and a characteristically secular desire to draw a line between religion and power or material power, is further animated by a contradiction in the very understanding of belief, one that lends itself to an ever more pronounced vigilance against the potential power of religious beliefs and acts, right? In other words, the suggestion which is explored by Agrama across different secular states and not just limited to Egypt, is that under a liberal secular legal regime, suspicion of religious belief is a flip side of religious freedom, okay? And that one cannot disentangle one from the other, right? Okay, and which ends up, according to Agrama, coercing people with respect to their basic beliefs or positions, and thereby opens up an aporia, as Agrama puts it, a kind of a fault line within secularism itself, between the aspired for freedoms and the means by which they can be ideally realized. Agrama, therefore, Taylor's argument does not discern this central difficulty, what he calls this aporia, okay? Because it does not fully account for what he calls this contradictory nature of suspicion, historically rooted in the secular ideal and practice of religious freedom, and even seems to articulate this contradictory structure despite, as Agrama recognizes, Taylor's counseling against the singling out of religion. Right? To be sure, this reading of the way this contradictory structure of suspicion works in Taylor's argument about secularism is an intricate, albeit forced one. For one, Agrama reads into Taylor's argument a construal of religion as essentially a species of belief, right? Holding that such a construal is itself a historical outcome of the suspicion that divides it and opposes it to knowledge, and even articulates into the principle that it ought to be separated from material power. And secondly, that Taylor's insistence about the need to be united on a set of basic values, while seemingly a precondition for secular freedoms, is equally a characteristic manifestation of the secular state's modalities of suspicion. And therefore, it seems to me yet that such a reading is constantly running against the limits of its own historical standpoint, right? And its own unreflected context of emergence. Okay? In the context of Agrama, as I have already posited, this has to deal with the fact that his order of questioning, okay, does not break with that scholarly genealogy, okay, that I alluded to at the beginning of this lecture, the division between the fact of the religious and or of the secular, and as opposed to the instrumental use of religion and or of secularism on the other. But there is more, and I think this is an important methodological point, and I think this is a point which perhaps has to be taken note of in the context of genealogically embedded forms of analysis, is that there is also the ease with which most genealogical modes of analysis tend to confuse preconditions. Plainly, what I mean by preconditions, the histories of what led up to something, okay, and effects. There is a tendency to confuse preconditions and effects. Effects here meaning the aggregate of changes which that something causes or that unfolds in respect to it. And I'm drawing this from a wonderful historian of science, Blumenberg, although he's talking about it in the context of the history of science, right? Okay. Now, I suspect that this conflation, okay, between preconditions and effects also underwrites agrama, and I think underwrites a lot of the ethnographies of secularism across terrains and so on. Although it can be mentioned in agrama's defense, and perhaps also across certain phases of work in the anthropology of secularism, that in determining which conditions are necessary about the specific workings of secular power, one may actually be involved in determining what is sufficient for those very conditions. It is nevertheless by no means clear within the space of this forced, albeit intricate construal, how the validity claims of various diagnoses offered, including its own, should be understood. Okay? In fact, the charge that agrama is pressing against Taylor's rendition of normative secularity, okay, that Taylor is denying the performativity of secularism, okay, or on agrama's claims that Taylor is insufficiently attentive to the bind of suspicion of contemporary secularity, could be turned against the former, against agrama as well. I'm afraid demonstrating this would require more exegesis than what I've already presented for you, okay, but what I want to speak about is the larger point about normativity, right? Which I wish to underscore here. Okay, and I have actually a quotation from this French philosopher of science, Georges Canguilhem, which goes like this: normative, okay, in philosophy means every judgment which evaluates or qualifies a fact in relation to a norm, right? But this mode of judgment is essentially subordinate to that which establishes norms, right? Okay? Normative, and this is important, normative in the fullest sense of the word is that which establishes norms, right? Etc. Okay? So in that sense, as I'm trying to point out, normativity, okay, although Canguilhem himself develops this notion of the normative in the context of biology, in the history of biology, etc., okay, but I think there are certain extrapolations possible when you deal with contested socio-political ideals and so on. Okay, indeed, indeed, if and somewhat formulaically, if one were to transpose the terms that I've just disclosed about normativity on any register being performative, okay, etc., then this would require us to think immanently with normative secularity, okay, and the space of its moral legal commitments, okay, and given that all normativity is performative, we should probably admit and or recognize that the various conditions and forces bearing upon normative secularity can open a space within the latter that we can retroactively see as having always already existed. This implies, in other words, seeing the space of normative secularity as always phenomenologically charged and expressive, quite independently of the forces and conditions bearing upon it, while also being differently enabled by those very conditions and forces. Of course, a history and anthropology of secularism of the kind that agrama delivers may also translate into this possibility, right, etc. And certainly his characterization of the problem space of secularism, where, okay, does actually inscribe that emphasis that I am also seeking to bring, right. But I am maintaining it is also premised as I'm trying to argue, it is also premised, I mean, Agrama's work and the Anthropology of Secularism is premised on a forced constriction of the space of normative secularity, one tantamount to me to restricting the space of its performativity. Okay? The normative force of Taylor's redefinition of secularism, okay, and the illumination about the nature and scope of secular moral legal commitments that it affords as a whole, can, I think, still hold our attention. Okay? But there is a second order of complication that we must consider as part of normative secularity's imminent ground. Okay? And I think in order to get a sense of this second order of complication, okay, I turn to an insightful political theorist, Cecile Laborde, okay, who, incidentally, working on the same normative terrain that Taylor works with, but brings, you know, attestations upon the space of the normative, which are, you know, consistent with the order of my remarks out here. Okay, so the second, that's why it's important to take the insightful political theorist Cecile Laborde, who, while admitting to Taylor's characterization of the secular age as one in which religious belief no longer structures our social imaginary, okay, and instead religious belief has only become one option among others, okay, one possibility among others, one of the ways in which we give meaning to our lives, etc., yet discerns, okay, that we secular moderns also give special primacy to freedom of religion, okay, which is, as Cecile Laborde puts it, standardly presented as an archetypical liberal right. Okay, that's why Cecile Laborde actually sees a paradox. There is a paradox within liberal secularity or normative secularity, okay, which she formulates as follows. How and why do we protect freedom of religion when in an age when religion is not special, right, etc. Okay, that's why I think it's interesting to take this measure. So as I said, I mean, I think I've got all my grounds covered, and there are still certain, you know, points and leakages here and there which you could possibly pounce on much later. But what's the discourse without some leakage somewhere which people can kind of, you know, cling on to and so on. Okay, although I've made every effort to kind of, you know, close up every possible option that might be there. But in closing up options, you perhaps might be opening up other weaknesses and so on. So this paradox, and I think is important. I mean, how or why do we protect freedom of religion in an age when religion is not special, right? Religion is just one option among others. Okay, quite independent of the paradox itself, the ground which is covered by Laborde is interesting. Okay, and to the extent her treatment finds its way through a specific translation in law and policy terms, okay, of an aspect of Taylor's redefinition of normative secularity along the lines indicated above, and yields a theory of religious freedom that calls for equal treatment of religious and secular conscience. Laborde's discussion opens up further considerations at the heart of contemporary secularity and its own normative ground. Okay, I think also because, and in fact the discussion of Laborde is more fascinating also because it engages with the entirety of the oeuvre of Charles Taylor in terms of his emphasis on strong evaluations and so on. Okay, Laborde urges us to consider, as part of an egalitarian theory of religious freedom emanating from normative secularity, as configured through Taylor, the tensions that could underwrite such a theory, right? Not quite only what does it mean exactly to treat religious and non-religious conceptions of the good alike, okay, but also why is religious conduct worthy of protection in the first place, okay? she also offers an important clarification impinging on the very nature and scope of secular moral legal commitments, which, when with particular acuity and deference to Taylor's ideas, she alludes to a key feature of the freedom of religion, which, as she puts it, is strangely neglected by contemporary liberals, namely, and I shall quote Laborde, freedom of religion, and I'm quoting, freedom of religion, in contrast to more generic freedoms of thought, belief, and association, relies on a moralized distinction between valuable and non-valuable activities, okay, and serves to protect a subset of the former. Okay, right? It is a freedom to pursue a specific end and activity. And I'm quoting, it refers to the pursuit of a conception of the good with a specific shape, content, and form rather than a means, as it were. Furthermore, in the case of exemptions and accommodations, and please note when you're dealing with law and policy terms, questions of exemptions and accommodations become very critical. She makes the point that freedom of religion generates demands of positive assistance in pursuing those activities. Right? This means that when adjudicating such claims, it must be decided which claim correctly expresses the values underpinning the general principle. Okay? I mean, I think this quotation is quite valuable. What this entails, okay, is the point which Laborde also acknowledges, that openly perfectionist evaluations, okay, setting trivial against central commitments, or mere preferences against core convictions, and what is more, that such perfectionist discriminations are inherent in any serious reflection on the value of the freedom of religion. Okay? In fact, the point has a direct bearing on quite a lot of the work which is there in the Anthropology of Secularism, in that even as these perfectionist discriminations are alluded to in the course of their treatment, the prognosis on offer seems to be quite dismissive of such propensities as part of a general genealogical thrust. Okay? Of course, one is not denying that such perfectionist discriminations can also end up, as Laborde observes, giving the state the authority arbitrarily to discriminate between better and worse ways of exercising one's freedom. Okay? And clearly, this is what our contributors, clearly a lot of the work in the Anthropology of Secularism, in a manner of speaking, can be seen to be arraigning against. But this does not of itself restrict or constrict the space of normative secularity, right? If indeed, as I have tried to point out, normativity on any register is performative, okay, then the performativity of normative secularity has also to do with its moral legal commitments becoming normative, not quite only in the sense that is disclosed in the Anthropology of Secularism, okay, but also along the redefined lines of a revitalized analytics of secularism that I'm trying to indicate towards. I realize that this affirmation does not take care of the problems inherent to normative secularity and the nature and scope of secular moral legal commitments. Okay? In perspective, okay, if one wants to get a measure of normative secularity and the scope and nature of secular moral legal commitments, are our forms of truth-speaking or truth-seeking inherent to the modern law and to the state, which, while presupposing a certain organization of the subject, referent, and world, can also be productive of its normative refashioning. In fact, Laborde, in inflecting the paradox that we talked about underlying contemporary secularity in a way that is redemptive of its promise of equal treatment of religious and secular conscience, okay, and yet, as she perceptively remarks, there can be problems in collapsing religion into conscience, right? And implicitly assuming that the latter category, conscience, okay, is more inclusive than the former, namely religion, right? More emphatically, the redescription of religion as freedom of conscience, according to Laborde, can have the effect of perversely encouraging, and I'm quoting Laborde, perversely encouraging the most fundamentalist and rigid interpretations of religious dogma, right? And I think some of these allusions are, you know, if you look at the debate that is going on about, you know, the Lingayat as a separate religion, or indeed the superstition debate that and a certain bill which is there, etc. If you address the orders of these discourse, you will find some of these some of these conceptual windows actually getting some kind of a fruition, right? So the redescription of freedom of religion as freedom of conscience can have the effect of perversely encouraging the most fundamentalist and rigid interpretations of religious dogma, while also driving a normative wedge between two kinds of meaning-giving commitments, okay? Those that are inflexible and conscientious, okay, and those that are habitual and embodied, right? And in the process, as Laborde puts it, singling out individual conscience as opposed to cultural membership or community membership as especially worthy of protection, right? Of course, this latter effect may be important for securing further the nature of our secular moral legal commitments, right? That singling out individual conscience rather than community or cultural membership as worthy of protection. But the upshot may be, as Laborde attentively reminds us, that a self-proclaimed inclusive theory of freedom of religion actually excludes, okay, what most religious believers would take to be freedom of religion to be all about, right? Surely the orders of this construal is premised on religion as a matter of private conviction rather than as a public performance, right? And as Laborde helpfully prompts us, one could add that even when freedom of religion relates to actual performances and practices, in that sense has a more public face to it, okay, it still draws on its moral force from its presumed connection with individual conscience, right? In fact, the redescription of freedom of religion as freedom of conscience, while consistent with the individualization and subjectification of religious experience in contemporary societies, tends, as Laborde remarks, to favor a Protestant understanding of what religion is, right? Likewise, with reference to the problematic category of conscience, okay, it can translate into a proliferation of claims, right? Which leads to further problems of distinguishing within those claims, within freedom of conscience, trivial from morally significant claims or beliefs, okay, as well as getting a measure of what conscience really requires of us. In addition, I think collapsing the distinction between religious and secular conscience can translate into obscuring the reasons why religious conscience needs strong protection, okay, and at the same time ignoring some of the strongest justifications for protecting secular convictions, okay. In fact, conflicts between the demands of religious conscience and the commands of the state involve more than conflicts involving secular conscience. Surely, that, one is not reducing it to just that. The complications opened up would certainly require us to revisit our ideas of normative secularity and redraw the nature of our secular moral legal commitments. But as Laborde clearly states, the problems alluded to are not fatal flaws as unavoidable tensions within the politico-legal philosophy of religious exemptions, right, etc. Okay, and that's why I think there is something in that, that in the terms of normative secularity that one is talking about, in translating it into actual terms within which a certain theory of exemptions begins to be articulated. Okay. Okay. Now, I think this latter point needs underscoring, particularly since a lot of the work in the anthropology of secularism or the anthropology of religion are concerned to deliver directly on the problematic character of the essential practice test, okay, as determined by and within Indian courts, right? etc. And at stake, I reiterate it again, is the very ground and horizon of our secular moral commitments. Let me now quickly summarize what I have said so far, okay? And 2-3 minutes. I think I've tested your patience sufficiently, and hopefully this summary could bring you back to your feet, right? How might this juxtaposing of the claims of an anthropology and history of secularism with the demands of a normative order of construal given over to securing secularism change the way in which we approach the very nature and scope of normative secularity, or the nature of secular moral legal commitments internal to normative secularity? How? So I have juxtaposed this. How might this juxtaposition, okay, yield certain dividends for us, and what kind of dividends could it yield for us? I've already suggested it, but I'm just kind of compressing it into a set of concluding observations. For one, the scholarly genealogy implicating the study of these themes, okay, both reinforcing and reinforced by, as it were, the division that I talked about, the fact of the religious and or the secular, and the instrumental use of religion and or of secularism, okay, would have to be transcended, right? Okay, so this idea of religion as faith and religion as ideology, I think is beyond a point, doesn't yield any purchase for its purposes, for any kind of handle on phenomena. I'm not so sure Nandi himself would still cling on to the terms of that distinction. Okay, the moral psychology of religion, as indeed the secular, would no longer be the phenomenological or lived reality against which the politics of secularism is configured or staged, right? Second, okay, even if one wishes to stay with this diagnostic genealogy, whose limits I have tried to define for you, okay, we need to consider, okay, in the course of pressing after more complex understandings of the mediations between religion, law, and the state, the ground and horizon of normative secularity. Okay, so we need to consider the ground and horizon of normative secularity from within the questions that it provokes and the very normativity of the categories that it presupposes, right? And finally, normative secularity can and must emerge wholly as a discursive register in its own right, right? Okay, and I think the genealogical inflection onto the ways in which modern states handle the question cannot be the ultimate determinant of the ways in which normative secularity or some remodified idea of it can yield dividends. So that's why normative secularity can and must emerge wholly as a discursive register in its own right, whose immanent performativity can be set off in ways not entirely contingent upon the anthropology and history of secularism. In a word, as I put it in my abstract, I'm trying to redeem normative secularity from the genealogical constrictions that define and or frame it, right? So normativity, okay, is performative, tooth court, and a problematic of normative, of secular moral legal commitments might yet have to break with the pluralizing universalism of our times, even as, and this is very important, one becomes wary of a triumphalist history of the secular. I am surely not offering a triumphalist history of the secular in trying to redeem the space of normative secularity from the genealogical constrictions that seem to restrict it. I'm often fond of repeating these lines. A sensitivity to context need not produce context-sensitive results. Okay, so to speak about religion only in its lived context, and to argue that the lived context should be the context in which we begin to think about religion itself, perhaps might offer an alternative to other kinds of emphasis that are there, and politically perhaps necessary to do so. Okay, but in terms of a revitalized analytics that one is seeking to argue, you need to think concretely with this idea that sensitivity to context need not always provide context-sensitive results. Thank you. So now I'm up for scrutiny.
Hello, sir. Sir, you pointed out, am I audible?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Sir, you presented a little, you touched upon the topic of Lingayats and the whole issue which is going on right now. And
which issue?
The Lingayat
Yeah.
being,
Yeah.
I would like you to comment more on it, because like you just touched upon it and then you talked about secularism and everything. So it would be nice if you can like maybe put it in this context, if it's okay.
I think I might have to let that question pass, primarily, although I can offer certain hypotheses, but we do have Chandan out here who has worked on the question, because I'm also kind of thinking through that question. And I wouldn't want to commit myself to a line of analysis when I have not thought out that question. But I think in the order of my appraisal here, especially my working through Cécile Lebord, there are certain kinds of articulations available within that frame which allow for certain ways of understanding the context in which the whole controversy and its effects. I mean, keep the politics of it aside. I think there is a historicity to that question, although politics at every juncture has lended a particular bite to that historicity, etc. And I think it's not a simple question to be handling. So one will have to understand the history of the institutionalization of that faith, of that orders of faith, if you want to make sense within the registers of my appraisal that are being suggested. So in passing off the question, I'm not abdicating a responsibility. I'm only accounting for the fact that I think it's an extremely complicated question, which will have to implicate the history, a certain long history of religion. Okay? And I also find that much of our longer histories of religion get implicated within a modern problematic, and somewhere we need to be a little wary of the modern problematic within which the framing of the question of religion seems to participate, etc. Right? So in which case, so I can make general overtures, which some of which are already suggested in the context of my presentation, but I think in these longer histories of religion, which is a certain order of work that I'm opening out to, I think there is demands that come which also will have to place the entire modern problematic of religion in abeyance, right? Although there could also be claims that modernity accentuates the kind of problems that perhaps the kind of contemporary state maneuverings with it, or politicians maneuvering it make available. But I think it has a much longer history, and I also think that this longer history would also have to resist some of the essentializing tropes that attached either to Lingayat histories or to Veerashaiva histories, because I think the kind of essentialist tropes that have come to attach to it at this context are also part of historical and political developments in modernity, as indeed prior, and so on. So somewhere along the way, incidentally, this is not just true of Lingayats and Veerashaivas or the current contestations. This is true about the very nature of sectarian beliefs across the orders of Hinduism. All right, and I guess this is also true of Islam, if you were to look at what sectarianism does to Islam and so on. So I think it's a extremely hard question, but I had to make that suggestion only to point out for you that you know, the terms of analysis that I'm setting up here are terms of analysis which you can adapt, okay, for circumstances which are our very own, right? And that was what I was trying to indicate towards. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. It's very nice class for us. While we're discussing about secularism along with religion and religious understanding, as Talal Asad himself pointed out in his formation of secular in the introduction part, it has a more dimension rather than the religious understanding towards the politics. I don't know how can I clear that, but while we discussing, he's saying that this is secularism in political term, in political doctrine. It's more transcendent mediation. Just like while we're discussing about citizenship, and it has a close relation with the nation state and its necessity.
Sure.
So the religion, in a sense, in an anthropological perspective, is a legitimization to separate the separation between the religion and the politics, so that the secularism is very important as a political doctrine. I think, as Asad said, the secularism is, while we understand the secularism in a political doctrine, it emerged as a necessity of the politics or the necessity of the nation state in modern times.
Okay.
So how can we address this idea while we are confined the religion to understand the secularism? So our discussion, we discussed about the religion, how can we religious understanding should be understood in this in a normative secularity manner, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what.
Yeah. No, I see, one is definitely not dismissing the orders of appraisal that come in the context of Talal Asad's distinction between secularism and secular, right? And that the translation of secular into secularism as a doctrine oversees certain kinds of closures into the space of the secular that he's trying to restrict, right? So one is definitely not urging that mode of analysis is unimportant, or our students and researchers could not be doing something interesting with it. I'm only trying to formulate that there is a certain mold within which that analysis will proceed, right? There is I mean, please note, when I looked at, my choice of Agrama is very, very specific, right? Because somewhere Agrama is also, lending himself to a point where where he recognizes that there is this limit within that frame that Asad works with, right? And he's trying to do something more interesting with some of the terms that are there in Asad, but goes beyond, as it were. This is true also in in Saba Mahmood's work, if one were to see it along this axis, right, etc. In fact, Saba Mahmood's work, I think, the politics of piety is much more interesting than religious difference in a secular age, because in the religious difference in a secular age, there is this whole critique of modernity and of the modern state, which hangs. It's a kind of a genealogical emphasis. Now, somebody might say that this genealogical emphasis is part of a historical recognition that the state assumes a certain kind of a currency under modernity, which it doesn't quite acquire any other time and so on, right? So in that sense, perhaps that genealogical emphasis is important, right? I was only trying to indicate that what if some of these genealogical demands that are placed upon this analysis, the categories with which that genealogical analysis proceeds were to be just suspended, right? Were to be just kept aside and then begin to attend to the variety of ways in which there is a certain imbrication between religion and politics, right? Although the imbrication of religion and politics with the entry of the modern state begins to introduce particular classifications upon that imbrication, as it were. That's why I think it's important that you work with genealogy and you also work in spite of genealogy, right? For instance, if you look at the Indian, let me take an Indian example, and I was interacting with Rajiv Bhargava just last week, because Rajiv Bhargava was in the forefront of the secularism debate in India, and brought, I think, an extremely important set of emphasis upon the specificity of Indian secularism on the normative level, okay, at the normative level, which is interesting, and so on. But if you look at his work that has followed subsequently, where he is also trying to look at pre-modern situations, okay, and in the conference that both of us were participating in, he was presenting something about whether pre-modern religions have a certain plurality built into them. In fact, I confronted him with precisely this question. I mean, I'm not, but unfortunately it was within a space of the hall, so you couldn't clarify this beyond a point. Whether there is, I mean, given his interventions in the secularism debate, whether that armature of concepts that have overseen that secularism debate also informs the kind of analysis that he brings to pre-modern situations, right, etc. And I think it's an important question to ask. It's an extremely important question to ask, because somewhere along the way, if you are extending the terms of the analysis instituted in the context of modern secularism, okay, and then extrapolate it, it's not a question of anachronism or anything of that kind. No, I'm not saying that is anachronistic to be bringing modern categories and extrapolating it into the past. I think one was indicating something more than just anachronism, right? And I'm willing to recognize that scholars who are philosophically sophisticated of the kind that Rajiv is, surely there is a certain negotiation of the historical record that the philosophical negotiation provides. I'm willing to recognize that, because I also consider myself something of a philosopher, okay, and certainly not a historian. Okay, although both Rajiv and I, kind of absorb every available history on offer, right? But in raising those questions, okay, we also have to redraft the questions which instituted the analysis in the first place. And that's precisely what I'm seeking to do in trying to problematize that scholarly genealogy. That's why I use the word scholarly genealogy. If one were to say the genealogical analysis of Talal Asad, and one would go along the analysis or the suggestions that are underscored in your question. But if one were to see that analysis is not providing all the answers, okay, to the questions that it itself raises, then somewhere along the way we need to work in spite of that genealogy, as it were, right? And please note that, incidentally, if students read Foucault seriously and speak about their models of genealogy coming from Foucault, because somewhere Foucault is informing some of these anthropology of secularism, then surely Foucault himself did not devote much to analytic work. That there are works now trying to extricate a certain analytics that defines Foucauldian genealogical analysis, right, etc. And I think it's worthwhile for students, okay, to actually get into some of those formal analytical protocols that define genealogical analysis, right, etc. And that's why I was just kind of highlighting, perhaps over-accentuating the constrictions of a genealogy, almost saying that there is a diagnostic limit, right? Please note, within the diagnostic limit, they are extremely illuminating, right? But if one were to work with longer histories, right, and begin to situate even modernity within this longer history, not as constitutive, because much of these genealogies, the anthropology of secularism, is based on a premise about modernity being constitutive, right? If instead of seeing modernity as constitutive, you begin to see it as conjunctural rather than constitutive, then you see modernity and all its effects, secularism, nation state, etc., as part of that transition, as it were, then what does it do to the kind of analytical and historical diagnosis that yields? So what are that's why the question of, I was partly answering or perhaps differing from the force of that question in terms of application, is what if you do not see developments within modernity through the modern lens, even within modernity outside of the modern lens, and where do we get resources for thinking outside of modernity and using that to speak about modernity in fresh terms? It's only from our longer histories, from certain pre-modern past. There's absolutely fascinating work now coming, okay, on our pre-modern past, okay. But how do we assimilate the insights of that work, carry forward some of the bite of these genealogical criticisms which are premised on modernity as constitutive, okay, keep that bite, but say, no, there's more work to be done. And perhaps begin to address circumstances and situations more attentive to our circumstances and so on, is what one is talking about. So one is definitely not dismissive, and nor was your question implying that, I do recognize, but thank you for that question, because it allows me to clarify some of my own moves that I'm trying to make out here.
So just a follow-up question to what he asked. The emphasis that you're placing on normative secularity and the limitations of scholarly genealogy that you're trying to point towards, do you think that this excessive emphasis in a way sort of limits any further imagination of religion beyond identity or beyond politics, or any order beyond modernity? Do you think that sort of, can we say that this emphasis on normative secularity limits that imagination?
I'm actually, if I understand your question correctly, I think I'm actually emphasizing the opposite. I'm just saying that the re-engagement with the spaces of normative secularity might allow us, okay, because you are also in a sense casting aside that genealogy that implicates the analysis, you are beginning to attend to the phenomena of religion, right, and its attendant manifestations afresh, right, etc. So that's why I'm saying, look at Saba Mahmood's work in terms of the politics of piety. The politics of piety is, I think, her signature statement, and I think if she commands our attention, it's precisely for the force of that analysis. Although, please note, there are also, she speaks about the pious women, right, and in some sense trying to think outside of the frames of normative secularity, but taking religion seriously, right? But how much does she carry through the analysis of the pious women? right? What is the frame within which the pious women are often presented, right? One of the important demands of her work is to think outside the state as well, right? Etc. Think outside the state, right? I'm also underscoring that point that we need to think outside the state, but in thinking outside the state, you begin to attend to phenomena outside the state, which you will need to have categories and affirmations and analytical recognitions which can place some orders of recognition on that, right? And of course, it's not an absolute division, thinking within the state and thinking outside the state. It's not an absolute division at all, etc. In fact, the course that I teach, called Law, State and Society, we are all actually trying to think about what are the implications of Foucault's thesis on governmentality, right? And I don't entirely agree with the post-colonial scholarship on the ways in which governmentality has been articulated or supposedly articulated in post-colonial contexts, right? Etc. Because I think Foucault, in speaking about governmentality, was actually instituting a more complicated problematic of state and society, and not reducing it to just the question of the state, etc. So that's why I think if you want to take the phenomena of behavior, human behavior, and the complexities of human behavior, which is of course contextually determined, seriously, okay, then we need to be actually aware of the genealogies that participate in the kind of analytical categories that we bring to make sense of those. Please note, those analytical categories are not just they are historically and genealogically inflected, but they are also disabling mechanisms. I mean, they enable, of course. I mean, within the diagnostic limit, there's so much of interesting work which I think all of you could do, and so on. But then, if you handle flux, if you handle the complexities of behavior and circumstance, then there is something that is always in excess. Or rather, I would go with that expectation that our situations, even the Lingayat Veerashaiva classification, there is a certain kind of an excess that attaches to it, okay, that we need to get the measure of, okay, and so on. So, does this answer your question, or did you have something else in mind? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, we'll close. Yeah, that should close.
Thanks a lot.
Huh?
Thanks a lot.
Oh, thanks, yeah.